Hey everybody, this is Mr. M, Mr. McCarthy, and I'm here in my son's room here. It's kind of the only place I can get a little quiet right now, but I thought since we're doing some of these YouTube uploads for the Seam YouTube, I'd just kind of go over some of my interests. And some of you might know I have a real interest in history, particularly American history, and over the years, it's fun to read books about it and see videos. But one thing that I think is really interesting is to collect memorabilia, or, if you can, actually get an actual artifact. So, what's an artifact? Well, an artifact is actually an item that, is usually, would be man made, or, you know, an item in history that has survived the years. And if you hold on to one, you're holding on to a piece of history. And I do have some artifacts that maybe in later videos I'll show you. Some have been inherited, which means it passed down through my family. And I'm sure everybody at home has own, artifacts, something from the past. Sometimes it can be 20 years ago or maybe 100 years ago that your grandparents, great grandparents have passed down. And these items are very interesting to have. Anyways, my interest in American history and brought me to collect some different things. And in particular, what really got me into history was reading about the Civil War. Now, the American Civil War was a very deadly conflict. It lasted from 1861 to 1865. And it was a war between the states, the North and the South. So it was actually a war within the United States. And it was fought over really the slavery issue, because the South wanted to not only continue the institution of slavery but expand it into the Western territories. These were areas where Americans hadn't really made into states. They were open land, like places, in present day it would be like Nebraska and Kansas, these places, and further west even. And the Americans had gained a lot of land, so there was a real decision. Is this land going to be, are we going to keep slavery as an institution in this land that we've acquired, or are we going to make it free like the North? And this caused a lot of friction, and there was a war. And eventually slavery was abolished, thankfully, because of this war. But the war was deadly, as I say, and I think the figures are 600,000 people lost their lives in some manner during the Civil War. All right, so I'm going to get to my artifacts. Actually, you know what? I have to make a clarification. For these, they're not artifacts. Remember, artifacts are actual items that have survived the years. Like, say, for instance, if you had an old painting or something like that from your grandmother's that's been around for 80 years, that's an artifact or an old item. But these are replicas, so they're kind of exact copies of what would have been in the Civil War. So I thought I'd just show you. And first, maybe what we'll start off with is this right here. And I don't know if you can tell, but that is, and it's a little broken, I have to say, the visor, and I kind of gave away what it is. It's a hat, or as in the Civil War, it was known as a kepi. And these were often pretty much the most common type of military hat you'd see in the United States Army. It has that distinctive deep blue color. And this one doesn't fit me, but it would have been worn like that. It wasn't a very practical hat. It didn't cover your back of the neck, so you could easily get sunburned. And the war was in the South mainly, so you can imagine the hot Virginia sun burning on your neck. This wasn't a very practical hat. And in fact, a lot of the soldiers took to wearing what was known as a slouch hat. It has a big brim around it. It kind of looked like a messy cowboy hat rather than wear these. These were known as kepis. And the French army, I think, were the first ones to really use them. You still see them today, actually, I think in France they have a version of the kepi. It's a little more straight and flat, but at the top. But French police sometimes wear these. But that's the kepi. They had a variety of hats in the Civil War that they wore. But this was one of the most common for the Union Army. That would have been the Army of the North. The Army of the North. And Massachusetts would have been fighting in the North. We would have been fighting for the Union Army. The next thing I want to show you is what would have been the most common type of coat the average soldier would have worn in the Civil War. And this was, I believe it was called a frock coat. I have a book here, I can reference that. But this would have been, it had very simple coat. 1, 2, 3, and then to be a fourth button there. Very simple, again, keeping in that blue color, dark blue. And this was the most common coat, the average soldier. You know, there were a variety of uniforms in the Civil War, but eventually the Union Army just kind of standardized everything. So let's see if I can get this top button off. All right, there we go. And that would have been known as the frock coat. Next, let's go to what would have been, I have a book here that this is a book with all the different things that a Union Army soldier would have maybe had. And we can see definitely, there's the coat, that I just wore. So that was very typical. This cap was another type of cap they might have worn. This is another hat some of the soldiers would have worn. It was called a Hardy hat. So there was a variety of different items a Civil War soldier would have had. Next, we have these long trousers. And they had overalls. And these trousers have a different color. They're sky blue. These were very typical of the soldiers in the Civil War, both North and South. They're very long and kind of, I've worn them before. They're pretty hot. You know, none of these clothes were very practical or comfortable, but that's because back then there wasn't, basically the fabrics were a lot more coarse and we hadn't really advanced in that stage as far as clothing wear and design. And in keeping with that theme, we have the shoes, and these are, you know, you can notice the soles very hard and the heel very, very simple. You know, it's almost very simple, very coarse, and again, not very comfortable. However, shoes were very important to have because a lot of soldiers, particularly in the Confederate Army, that would have been the Army of the South, didn't have shoes at the end of the war because supply chains had really stopped and it was hard to not only have shoes but to even feed the army. So if you had shoes, you were a lucky person at the end of the war, especially in the Confederacy. North, you probably would have shoes because they had a stronger supply chain. However, there's a footage or a scene in the movie Glory, which is about the 54th Black Regiment in the Civil War, and some of them didn't have shoes. And it's a good scene. It really illustrates that. Okay. Next, we'll go over to a kind of a mug that they might have had. Very basic, kind of tin. And coffee, believe it or not, coffee was one of the most popular beverages in the Civil War. Everybody had coffee, you know, they loved it and they would drink it all the time. Sometimes when they didn't have coffee beans, they would use hickory and other types of things, sometimes even peanuts to roast and make a type of coffee. It was very popular, and this would have been something they might have had not only for their coffee but maybe for their other meals, and to keep flour, because flour was very important to have, or beans. They might keep dried beans in here. Everything was very simple and very basic in the Civil War as far as supplies. And let's see. Oh yeah, so this book I have is really interesting. I just showed you. It has lots of different things a Civil War soldier might have had. And let's see here. Yep, all right, so we kind of went through that. And then here's another book I have. It's good to, you know, sometimes with your items, if you have a book to go with it, you can read up on it. And This is interesting. It says, in talking about the uniforms, it says, um, tragic mix-ups on the battlefield convinced the Union Army to make light blue trousers, as we just saw, and dark blue tops standard. And some of those mix-ups were because early in the war, some of the Union Army actually had gray uniforms. And some of the Confederates on the South had blue uniforms. So that sometimes they didn't know. Oh, there goes my timer. They didn't know who was who. So eventually the Union Army just standardized everything. And standardized means to make everything the same, really. Textile manufacturers cut corners to meet sudden demand using compressed fibers of recycled wooden goods to make a material called shoddy. So they use all these fibers to make a material called shoddy. And now that word is in the lexicon as a new adjective or description for poor workmanship. So whenever you hear the word shoddy, like that's a really shoddy piece of cloth. Well, that word originated from the Civil War. All right, and let's see. Finally, let me see. Another interesting thing I like, again, I like to see how people really lived, not just kind of read about the battles or the politics. I want to see how the average person lived. And this is interesting. This is a recipe book, or it's actually a Confederate receipt book, but it shows all different types of recipes and different, let's see here, different remedies they might have used. And so, for instance, one thing, if there's a recipe in here for pumpkin bread, so the Civil War soldier might have wanted to have pumpkin bread. So to make pumpkin bread, they would boil a good pumpkin in water till it was quite thick. Pass it through a sieve, that's like a colander, I guess, and mix flour so as to make a good dough. This makes an excellent bread. Another thing they did was make biscuits, very simple biscuits. I think we actually did this in EYP last year. And you take 1 quart of flour, 3 tablespoons of cream, mix well through the flour, 2 tablespoons of shortening, 1 tablespoon of soda, dissolved in warm weather of sufficient quality, and it would make a quart of flour. So they had all sorts of different kind of clever ways to make do with little, because they had, again, there wasn't much to go around, especially for the Southern soldiers. They were, at the end of the war, starving. Then there's even remedies, kind of remedies would be to help you if you got sick. And if you were out in the field far away from anything, you might need to use what's around you. So it says cure for the chills. The plant commonly called the horsehound is said to afford a certain cure. Boil it in water and drink freely of the tea. So, I wouldn't recommend doing that now, but back then, they had to make do with what they had. And this is an interesting book. It gives you all sorts of different recipes they use, different ways they would make things, like they would make soap. They made the thing called honey soap. So they really made do with what they had. All right, so that is basically my first little lesson on my interest in history and also artifacts. Again, some of those are not artifacts, but they're actually replicas, but they're exact copies. And it's interesting, if you love something, if you're really interested in a subject, really get deep into it. Don't just read about it or watch a video. See if you can get some items and really, make the food. If you're interested in, say, a historical ancient Rome or whatever it may be, see what they ate. Not only just who they were, in the big picture, but who they were kind of everyday life. All right, that's it for now. Okay, thank you very much.